Hello, I'm Jim Turk, and I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression at Toronto Metropolitan University. And I want to welcome you to today's event. The subject today is going to be on intellectual freedom and the challenges that we're facing increasingly with the demands for censorship, both in universities and in libraries. I'd like to begin, however, by acknowledging that the territory on which I'm speaking to you today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and today is the home of many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. I also, before we begin, want to thank the co-sponsors for today's discussion, and they are the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, the Edmonton Public Library, the Milton, Ontario Public Library, the US-based National Coalition Against Censorship, the Ontario Library Association, PEN Canada, the Toronto Public Library, and the Vancouver Public Library. Today, libraries and universities are facing growing demands for censorship, whose proponents see censorship as an essential tool to make a better world. School boards are facing demands that certain books be removed from school libraries. Public libraries are facing challenges not only to books and films in their collections, but also to programs they offer, such as drag queen story time. Why are we seeing so many challenges and so much enthusiasm for censorship from all sides of the political spectrum? How should public bodies respond to this? And what does all this mean for social justice and equity and the future of democracy? We're very fortunate today. Our featured guest is Emily Knox. Emily is one of the leading thinkers on intellectual freedom in North America. She's an associate professor in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her research interests include information access and intellectual freedom and censorship. She's a member of the Mapping Information Access Research Team. She's the author of several books. One is entitled The Foundations of Intellectual Freedom that was published last year. And one before that was Book Burning in 21st Century America, which I'm reading right now and is very interesting. She's chair of the US-based National Coalition Against Censorship, and she's the editor of the Journal of Intellectual Freedom and Privacy. Welcome, Emily.
Hello.
In conversation with Emily today will be Toni Samek. Toni is a professor and former chair of the School of Library and Information Studies at the University of Alberta. She's the author of a number of books, including Intellectual Freedom and Social Responsibility in American Librarianship, Librarianship and Human Rights, a 21st Century Guide, Information Ethics, Globalization and Citizenship, and Minds Alive, Libraries and Archives Now. She twice convened the Canadian Library Association's Advisory Committee on Intellectual Freedom, served on the Canadian Federation of Library Associations Intellectual Freedom Committee, and served 2 terms on the Canadian Association of University Teachers Academic Freedom and Tenure Committee. And she's the recipient of a number of teaching awards. Welcome, Toni.
Thanks for having me.
The format for today's session will be a conversation between Toni and Emily. After about 45 minutes or so, they will turn to the audience so that you can join the conversation by asking questions or raising issues you'd like them to discuss. If you look at the bottom of your screen right now, you'll see at the bottom a button that says Q&A. So at any time during their conversation, a question comes to mind that you would like to ask them or would like more information about or want them to follow up on, please just click on the Q&A button and write down your question at that point. You don't have to wait till Toni turns to Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator of the center, to share the questions that have come in. So please, as you're listening to them, think of questions that you'd like to ask them and write them down, and then we'll have time for significant contribution from the audience and their response to them. I think that's it. Over to you, Toni and Emily. I look forward to your conversation.
Thank you so much, Jim, and also to Ange and Luke and Emily for all the work to prepare for today. Emily, it's such a delight to have the opportunity to talk to you for an extended period of time this afternoon, although I know it won't be enough, and I'll look forward to catching up with you soon. When Jim was doing the land acknowledgement, I was actually visualizing roaming around the campus at Urbana-Champaign in Illinois as I was coming down from a doctoral student, of course, from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, to use the American Library Association archives. And I was digging into the American Library Association's Social Responsibility Roundtable papers and those of, the iconic library activist Sanford Berman, and poking around at the State Historical Society of Wisconsin, their papers, set of papers on the Radical Research Center. And I know that you're at Illinois now, Urbana-Champaign. And we started crossing paths years ago at conferences, moving in our field, it's sort of interdisciplinary, of course, the information ethics community or intercultural information ethics community. And I was really taken with your work and works of Rafael Capurro, Uruguayan in Germany now, Germany-based, and Hannah Spritz in South Africa, Marty Smith in the U.S., who's went on to be a chaplain. And I noticed that you all had a background in religious studies at the outset, and I was wondering if you could just share a little bit of your journey to where you are today at Urbana-Champaign, Illinois.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I think this is an incredibly important topic, not just because I study it, but because I think it has such an impact on all of us. So where I usually like to start is to talk about my mom, who was a high school librarian for 32 years. And she was always bringing home the Banned Books Week items. And I noticed that my favorite authors would show up on those lists. And so I often did my book reports on, say, Judy Blume, who was one of my very favorite authors. And I was always very upset to see that she was on the list of most challenged books from the American Library Association. So I guess I would say I've always been interested in this issue of banning books. Like, what are people trying to do when they try to ban a book? When I went to college, I did do religious studies. I was particularly interested in sociology of religion, especially looking at the Christian right in the United States. I did my senior thesis looking at fundamentalism and evangelicalism in the United States and their development. And that was what I did for my first graduate degree, was expand my study of sociology of religion. I then thought I was going to get my PhD, but I actually stopped. I worked at a law firm for 2 years, which was very instructive. I learned I did not want to be a lawyer. I learned a lot about big law. I worked at one of the largest law firms in the world, which is Kirkland and Ellis, in their bankruptcy division, and just learned a lot about what does it mean to get caught up in a huge legal system and how does big law operate. After that, my mom had always encouraged me to get my MSLIS. She said, it's a great degree. You learn so much. You can be interested in so many different things. It goes with you. And so I finally decided to get my master's in library information science here at Illinois. I worked as a theological librarian at the General Theological Seminary for the Episcopal Church for 5 years in New York City. And then I realized I was ready to get my PhD. And I knew exactly what I wanted to study. I wanted to study why people ban books. What I didn't know is the theory about it. How was I going to talk about the reasoning behind it? So I really got interested in book history and print culture while I was at Rutgers. I was introduced to this field that many people don't know about, that people actually study the book as an object, about text transmission through time. And that is what really opened up a lot more vistas for me for thinking about my research, because I was able to pull in um, how we think about reading, how we think about the book as an object, how knowledge is transmitted, especially through text from one generation to another. And that is really what I pulled in for my research, and how I started thinking about why banned books. That was my main area of research for my dissertation, and it continues.
Thank you. That's really helpful to have that background in. And I'm pleased to say that our program at the University of Alberta still has our history of the book course, LIS 582. So thank you for making such a strong case to keep that going to our curriculum committee. Listening to your journey, it does reinforce for me how many different groups and communities that you interact with, especially now when you're doing so much media work. And I remember, I think the year was 2007, a colleague of mine here from the University of Alberta was president of the, not at that time, he was chair of our advisory committee on intellectual freedom for the Canadian Library Association in 2007. And the CLA had an award for the advancement of intellectual freedom in Canada that was given out every year to 2 years to, of course, a worthy recipient. And in that year, 2007, under Alvin's leadership, the award went to the Canadian Journalists for Free Expression. And when Alvin made contact, they were delighted but surprised to learn of this award, to be, have this reach from the Canadian Library Association. And it seemed that they were really delighted to have this forging connection, but it hadn't really realized how librarians and journalists were in sister professions in terms of, access to information and informed citizenry and so forth. And Alvin had some cross collaboration for some years after building that bond. And I've been reflecting on, just in recent interactions with you as well, how many groups that you are involved with. So, of course, right now you're leading the National Coalition Against Censorship in the US. And I think I was present virtually last year when an award was given to Judy Bloom for her work. Yes. And I adore her work as well. You've obviously done work with the American Library Association. You've written about trigger warnings, book banning, and so forth. You've done university administration and certainly are engaged with academic freedom. You are interacting with journalists all the time. I know you're giving a talk soon for the Heterox Academy community, which has a library community as well. You've looked at amplification and social media and big tech. And you're, of course, paying attention to diversity, equity, inclusion in legislatures. You give invited lectures to academics. You do professional development and staff training within library institutions. You've been invited from, British Columbia Library Association in Canada to give a keynote last year. And I know there's more interest, of course, in Canada, including with the Center for Free Expression. You are involved with talking to people in the publishing community. You were with the Freedom to Read Foundation as a leader president. You're teaching, you're writing. But so many communities that you're involved with. And I'm wondering what you think about, what are the best bridges across these communities, across the cultural network? And then so that's the first question, what are the bridges? And obviously you're one of the people that makes a bridge, but also, how does it become challenging to not have us all doing the same thing and expending so much energy? Maybe we're sometimes become in silos from one another, so that we are more aware and more working together. And it does bring back to mind that, thinking about journalists and librarians not necessarily knowing or understanding exactly what we were doing to support the same causes.
So actually, I'm going to say that my training as a librarian is what really helps me here, because one thing that you learn in studying librarianship is really how to approach different people who have different needs. And so when I'm talking to different audiences, I really try to think about it. I basically go through a reference interview in my head and think, how do I make sure that I am answering the questions that these people actually have? Not necessarily what they say, but I try to approach with empathy. And to me, that is really the heart of librarianship. Our service orientation to making sure that people have what they need. Also, as a librarian, you really are aware of many different things at different times. So I am very good at finding out what people are talking about in various different sectors of society, because I've just become so accustomed to that. From doing selective dissemination of information in librarianship. And so I really feel like it's those skills that I learned in my program and also working as a librarian. So I was a theological librarian, but I should say that that doesn't mean that there were only 7 of us on staff. So I was also the archivist, the rare books librarian. I was over the circulation. There was only one person in circulation. Had to make sure that books got put on the shelves. You just learn so much, and also the questions you're asked are not always the questions you think that you'll be asked. So even though I was asked working at the theological library, people would sometimes just ask me something about like, how do I take the 7 train to wherever in New York? And I had to make sure that I had a map of the subway in ready reference, because that was part of my job. And so when I think about giving these talks and interacting with so many different people, I really pull on my training to be able to really listen to what people are saying and think about what is it that makes most sense for this particular audience.
That's really helpful, Emily. And I mean, I know I've heard you say before, which I find really helpful in teaching, that libraries are dealing with individuals, not aggregates. And I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit more, particularly because doing a reference interview is not with the whole community, it's with one person. And so often we hear phrases around us about, this does not reflect our community, or our community this, or our community that. And many times when I've been able to hear and see you speak, you do scratch the surface of how well do we know our communities, don't speak for other people. But this idea also of breaking it down to individual versus aggregates, which I think comes up underneath some of the tensions around intellectual freedom and social justice that we see around us about individual versus collective.
Yeah, so this really goes into thinking about what do we mean by intellectual freedom. Intellectual freedom really rests within a person. It's not necessarily about a group. And this is why it can be difficult, because people vary so much. We all have identities. We all have, I'll just say intersectional identities. But we are also our own individual person. What librarianship really focuses on is the individual person and their information needs. Now, we can sometimes think about these collectively, like this is my community, but when someone comes up to the desk, they ask you a question. And so they're not representing everybody in the world. They are representing themselves, and they're saying, I have a question about this. I usually tell my students to think about it, it really becomes important when you talk about this with like children. So children have their own intellectual needs. When a kid comes up to you and says, I need to do a book report, I usually say frogs on frogs, that is the most important thing for you and that kid at that moment, right? How do you find the information they need on frogs? It may seem trivial, but it's very important, and you treat that person's information need as very important. So intellectual freedom is really saying, I'm looking at you as an individual person and thinking about your own information needs, not necessarily what the outcome of you interacting with this particular information is, but what is it that you are looking for as a person. The way I talk about this is really looking at different aspects of liberalism, especially political theory and liberalism. So if we look at, say, John Stuart Mill, we can see that he really talks about the individual and searches for truth and how do we understand truth. But what we talk about when we think about this other aspect of liberalism with social justice is much more about groups and identities. But what I try to say is, like, these are all together. These are all parts of liberalism. They're not conservative. You know, they are, if you're looking at them from a political theory point of view, they all go together. It's just that various parts are emphasized at various times. And so I think when we think about social justice, we sometimes don't think about the individual people and what it means to have justice for them. We think about large groups. But I try to remind my students that even though someone might have this identity, say, you know, I have an identity as a Black woman, which in some ways can tell you a lot about me, but also does not necessarily tell you everything about me as a Black woman in the United States, right? You can probably guess who I voted for, you know, various things like that. But you might not know why. You might not know something about my own individual interests and hobbies. That doesn't necessarily come up just from knowing that one part of my group identity. And our job as information professionals is to think about people as they come in through our institutions and what is that person's individual need, not necessarily who they are as a group. And this can be very hard, but I think it's an important part of what it means to stand for intellectual freedom.
Thank you so much. And what you said about the student and the frog and the book report and empathy makes me think about, you know, we also shouldn't be making assumptions about why somebody is seeking something through the cultural network. I mean, it may be that a project they were assigned for school that is something they're not that they don't particularly buy into, but it's something they need to do to pass the course. So, you know, what assumptions are we bringing? Or if somebody wants to interact with a so-called controversial, you know, piece of music or film or play or text of some kind, we don't know why.
Yeah, I think this is so important. We don't know why, and we also don't know what the outcome will be of a particular person interacting with something. So a lot of focus right now is on the issues of harm that particular works can do, right? And this is either from the right or the left, right? The reason why people try to ban books, I'll just put it that plainly, is because they're worried about the harm that will come when someone reads a particular book, whatever that perception is. But when you think about individuals, you actually don't know either what the harm will be or whether or not they even think it's harmful or why they're reading something. So I really talk about Rudim Bishop's ideas about mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. Sometimes it seems like people get very stuck on the idea of mirrors. So the idea that my kid will read this book about trans people and then they will think it's okay for them to be trans, right? Like it's this very one-to-one. But Bishop also talks about windows, that you can actually have a window into someone else's life. And that is part of the importance of reading about different people, because it might be that, well, my best friend came out as trans and I want to know more about them, right? It actually is not about me as a person. And that is part of what we think about when we think about intellectual freedom. Often I might be a person who wants to know what people have to say, right? I am curious as to their arguments. I want to know how to argue against them. This is, of course, classic Mill and on liberty. And when we try to remove things that might be harmful, we actually make it so that people cannot refute those arguments. And I'm just going to link this to social justice, because you can't have social justice without intellectual freedom. You have to be able to engage with ideas of what it means for the world to be just in the first place, in order for you to have a different outcome in the world. This seems very clear with the challenges that are coming through the United States right now, especially that often they are about justice. We just saw the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, not want to have the African American advanced placement course in Florida schools because he is concerned about something that he calls CRT. Whether it's CRT or not doesn't really matter. But how can you move to a world that would incorporate justice for Black folks in the United States if you don't learn the history? And this is why it matters so much. And sometimes that history, I want to say, involves reading things that are extremely painful for people who have that identity. So reading things about how Black people are less than and therefore should have been enslaved can be extremely painful for people like me who are Black. That doesn't mean that we should not read them, that we should not understand those arguments. And I feel like this is something that's often lost, because, of course, the way that people like Governor DeSantis thinks about it is that it will be painful for white people to read about. He's not actually focused on what it might be like for kids who are BIPOC to read about horrible things that have happened in their history.
I was in a conversation with colleagues at the Center for Free Expression just the other day, where we were talking about a shared belief that we don't get rid of racism by censoring racist speech. And part of what you just said brought that back to mind. Can you talk a little bit? I mean, and it makes me think about your work related to big tech and social media too, that sometimes we get so focused on a title, let's say Agatha Christie or something, and I know that you appreciate Agatha Christie. We get so focused on a title and a challenge that creates such a brouhaha, and we miss what's going on in a really big way around us, like big tech. Can you talk, and also I'm interested in what you have to say, really around amplification, but also around trigger warnings. If you could just do whatever you want with that, I'd be really keen to hear.
So I think that one thing that I've noticed is that there is a very shallow understanding of language. So language is both very important and also not important. So we have a lot of discussion about what should we call something. And, this of course relates to very esoteric ideas that come from basically continental philosophy about language and how it shapes our world. But what is often forgotten when we have these discussions is that it's shaped by everybody who uses it. So language changes over time. Getting rid of racist language, what often happens is that you develop different words that are racist for whatever concept you are trying to get across. So a good example is the word thug, right? Thug is not necessarily seen as racist, but because of how it's been used by various people, it has certain connotations in our head as to what it means. In my book, I talk about Let's Go Brandon. So if those of you who don't know, Let's Go Brandon was this very convoluted thing that happened, I believe, at a NASCAR event, and people were saying, F Joe Biden, and this person said, oh, but they're saying, let's go Brandon. And it just shows in a 2 seconds how, in fact, you can change language so that when someone is now wearing a shirt that says, let's go Brandon, it has nothing to do with let's go Brandon. It is about our current political climate. So I understand this idea that if we remove certain words, but words are always embedded in communities. And I have my students read the Randall Kennedy work on the N-word because I think it gives a very good overview of thinking about what does it mean to use this word, and a lot of it is based on who is using the word, right? Like it's not just the word itself. So you can't remove language from the community itself. And I talk about this in trigger warnings because trigger warnings themselves are embedded in communities. What I find is that, there are people who do not even know what a trigger warning is, and other people who use them for all sorts of things. But this is because their community uses them. But once again, we see that trigger warnings are also inflected by other things that we see in society. So they often are not used when we see videos of Black people being murdered by police, right? They are often only used in certain circumstances. One of the people actually talks quite a bit on how they hail, especially young white college women, as opposed to, say, veterans who've come back from war, so from Iraq and Afghanistan. That's not who we associate with trigger warnings. We tend to associate trigger warnings with a very particular identity, and so they aren't always as helpful or as useful as people would like them to be.
That's really interesting to bring out, Emily. Thank you. And certainly you and I are teaching in a particular profession that historically is, white women, college educated. And I would say there's not always a comfort with some historic arguments that we might have used in our profession. I realize the slippery slope argument as an example. Can you tell me a little bit about how you're managing that kind of teaching and learning?
So what I'm trying to get my students to understand is that when they really focus on issues of harm, they are in fact repeating issues that have plagued librarianship for a very long time. So if we look at the beginning of the library movement in the late 19th century, a lot of it was about how do we better people? We know what is best for people to read. And my favorite example of this is the 2-book system, where you could check out 2 books as long as one was nonfiction. because there was an idea that fiction is untrue and will harm you. When we think about it more historically, that in fact, a lot of libraries have operated from this paternalistic point of view about harm. And then when it's inflected with the idea that librarianship is a 80 to 90% female dominated, white dominated, it's 80 to 90% white dominated, and I cannot remember how much female dominated, I think it's about 70%, occupation, you then see that this is wrapped up in ideas about who is deciding what is harmful for other people. I worry about us going back to the ideas that we actually really wrestled with in the early 20th century about librarianship, and what does it mean to let go of some of the more paternalistic philosophies that underpinned providing best reading, right, for people, and who is saying that something is best. When I think about things like slippery slope arguments, these come up so much when we look at banned books, because people are always concerned that if someone reads about something, then this outcome will happen. It's just like, it's almost like you're on a precipice and you just go down this hill into something, right? Into basically having bad moral character, however someone is interpreting that. And I'm always concerned about those types of arguments because, of course, they don't take the individual into account. And I worry that often librarians are looking at things through a censorship lens, right? Through their own biases, as opposed to saying, you know, this fits with our collection. It fits with our collection development policy. Therefore, we should have it in the library. And in fact,
starting with access rather than starting with censorship.
Yes. And, you know, if you are concerned that some outcome will happen, you know, it's really on parents, you know, to be aware of what their kids are reading. But really, that's a reason why we have these policies, is to make sure that we are thinking about the mission of our institution and what fits in for the materials that we're buying.
Thinking of parents, I mean, this brings back, as you know really well, in the 1990s, the American, ALA, the American Library Association, oldest and largest in the world, was formed in 1876. And it really got all the way up to the 1990s before it was fully put on the defensive by lobbyists, as, it became kitchen table conversation around the perils of internet access for kids, for example, and Dr. Laura and company being very, very effective at lobbying and getting money for lobbying to put the American Library Association, I think, on its biggest defensive ever historically up till that time, because ALA took the position that we're not the police, we're not the parents, we're not the guardians. We will provide education and instruction and information about how to navigate the internet as safely as possible, but nothing is ultimately purely safe, and safe space is a tricky thing. But now we see again our library associations and other nodes on the cultural network really put on the defensive. What do you think feels different now, even from the 1990s? And of course, we're before I'll let you answer that, or ask you to answer that. I mean, I can certainly say here in Canada, we're beginning to see the American playbook starting to roll out, even on our own library floors, not as extensively of course, but some of the action groups are certainly, repeating the American playbook here. But what is different now? And I know particularly because you're engaged with so many groups in the cultural network, thinking back to the earlier days, to the 90s and now, how would you characterize it?
So I like to answer this question two different ways. So what we see in this current wave is really an argument against the institution itself. So against public schools and public libraries, that there is something wrong with them, that they are providing too much access, that they don't have structures in place, that they are full of people who are too liberal, so on and so forth. But rather than focusing just on the collections, it's a focus on the people who work in the libraries or schools, and also on those schools and libraries themselves, that their own mission is not in keeping with traditional values or something like that. The reason I like to answer this in two different ways is that actually this has always been true of public institutions in the United States. I'm afraid I cannot speak to Canada, but in the United States, the public library and public school movement have always been under suspicion. It's a country where people feel like education should take place in the home. People don't really like to pay taxes, and so they've always had this suspicion. And actually it's inflected with the issue of like being a female dominated profession for both teachers and librarians, that makes them suspicious. So if we look at the development of these movements, we can see that over time, there's always been some fight against having these institutions that are supported by the public through taxation, for developing the upcoming generation. The public school movement really came because very wealthy people wanted more informed employees. And so they decided that, okay, let's give this a try. That's essentially what they said. But it wasn't really from a place of like, let's make a better tomorrow. It was really about workers. So you can see how issues of capitalism get involved in these issues and in these things. I just think it's important that, yes, we are in a new space here with how we're thinking about the library, and but it is not necessarily something brand new. And I just want to say that I really am thinking about something that I saw in one of our newly minted doctoral students, Dr. Verna Morales. In her dissertation, she says that loving your library is different from trusting your library. And that is really something that we are seeing. People love their library with like a nostalgic point of view. And sometimes with their schools, they think about like going to the game or something like that. But they don't necessarily trust the institution or the people who work there. So I think these are very important parts to think about when we think about what is happening now with all these challenges to collections, materials, and also to the people themselves who work in these institutions.
Thank you. This brings to mind, I forget what year it was, something like 20 years ago, but a Canadian author, scholar, activist, Naomi Klein. I don't know if you remember, she gave a speech. There was that joint American Library Association, Canadian Library Association conference. It was the year of SARS. It can't be 20 years ago.
There, it was in Toronto.
And she had that great piece, I mean, it's publicly accessible online about librarianship as a radical profession. And she talked about, this is a group of women that goes against global market fundamentalism that wants to give access to freely give access to information and recycle it. And so, is there a misogyny underneath here? I mean, it was a great speech. But I agree with you. We've gone through cycles of this through, many times in our field, but at the same time, it feels like in this moment, maybe we're not as prepared as we need to be, despite our history, despite that we've been through this before. I mean, do you have optimism that we're going to be able to hold any ground? What are you thinking with the assaults around us?
So I have been encouraging people to be political. I will say that, I am fairly liberal, progressive myself. And what is always discouraging to me is the unwillingness of people on the left side of the spectrum to really grab the reins of power and to encourage people to organize. Which seems strange, right? Like the left should be about organization, but there's some feeling that there are certain types of organization that are illegitimate. So I was just giving a talk and someone said, well, the other side, they just put up a Facebook group and they're against us. And I'm like, well, put up your own Facebook group, find people to join with you. I mean, there's no reason why you shouldn't call on your own community. And I know that can be uncomfortable, but allowing the other side, however you might think about that, to always use grassroots and organizing apparatuses, social media, to really get their ideas out there and never always just reacting to it as opposed to being proactive. You should know who you can call on if something happens at your institution, right? You should already have that in your head. A lot of libraries have Friends of the Library, but somehow those are apolitical organizations. Why are they apolitical? That doesn't make any sense. The library is a political organization because it is taxpayer supported, right? It is something that the community has said that this is important, therefore it has to be political. And I would like us to get out of the idea that something is political means that it is bad. That's like how I hear people saying it. So I really think thinking about advocacy and organizing and why these institutions matter, being able to articulate that very well, why these individual books matter, thinking about it yourself, being more comfortable supporting freedom of expression, intellectual freedom, thinking through your own ideas about why that matters for you as a person, I think is really where we need to go.
And certainly in my experience and historically, and thinking of the 90s in particular, the rise of more and more Friends of Libraries groups were very engaged from the right and very skilled. And I know that you work with trustees and boards. Do you have any thoughts, given what you've just said? I mean, people have the right to run to be on a board.
Yes.
So what's your take on what's going on now?
So, so I'm the chair of the board of the National Coalition Against Censorship, and I'm also been trained to be on boards. And so what people need to do is really start seeding their boards. Encourage people who you know will support the library to run for office or for school board. If you aren't able to run, show up at the meetings. If something happens, bring your kids to the meetings. Like that, you can't do anything better than bringing your kids and showing this civic engagement and how you can stand up. The really great thing about board meetings is how seriously they take each individual. I've watched a ton of board meetings, and during public comment, somebody who lives there can stand up and talk. You actually get to speak to power, right? In a way that is so direct and we don't really see in other circumstances, which is, of course, why people have a lot of engagement with their institutions, because you can speak directly to those institutions. But I'd say also it's on the people who run public libraries and public schools to educate their board, so to what the mission of the institution is about things like freedom of expression, intellectual freedom, how the policies work, open up the procedures in a library. So some of my work is just about how opaque library procedures are. Libraries are magical. A book appears, and how did it get there? Tell your board how those decisions are made, right? Because I think that people think that they're made in a vacuum, but actually there are so many steps that happen before the book gets to the shelf, including, for example, that someone has to put labels on the book and it has to get those plastic jackets. Somebody is doing that. Now, sometimes that's outsourced to Baker and Taylor, but sometimes it happens in the library itself. So thinking through all those things is really important, and educating the people who will make the decisions for your institution is also important.
Thinking about not in a vacuum, and I can see we've got about 10 minutes to go to make sure we leave healthy time for Q&A. I know that you do work with the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, IFLA, and that, yeah, members of our community don't, sometimes they think a library or a theater or, museum archives, whatever it may be, has gone rogue. In our case, typically the intellectual freedom policies and related policies around meeting rooms, programming, collections, internet access policy, and so forth are aligned with, maybe not exactly the same language, of course, but aligned with regional, provincial, territorial, in your case, state, national, and international rhetoric, all the way up to IFLA and UNESCO, and the Public Library Manifesto, the School Library Manifesto, and so forth. And that this particular library hasn't gone rogue, that it is part of a matrix, but the members of the community may not know that. But I did want to get your take on international perspectives. Of course, we're speaking from Canada and the US and North America. There was a piece that somebody sent me the other day that was published January 16th, 2023 by Aaron Toe, Free Speech and Eternal Struggle. And I just pulled out a few phrases for you to comment on. That censorship often victimizes those intended to help, and highlighted were journalists, human rights workers, critics of governments, opposition politicians, and particular examples around students in China, women in Iran, dissidents in Russia, and resurgence of authoritarianism, political polarization, misinformation, and disinformation. I know an area you work in, and cancel culture. Can you just speak a little bit, if you don't mind, Emily, to your experiences and thoughts, especially as you've engaged at that IFLA international context?
So I have to say, one of the most interesting things that I had with my experience with IFLA was right after former President Donald Trump was kicked off of Twitter, because I didn't really have any problem with that. It's a private company, right? But the people in the Zoom conference meeting that I was in were extremely concerned, because what does it mean that the president of the United States could be kicked off of this major platform? You know, it really showed how powerful Jack, that the owner of Twitter was, that he actually in many ways was seen to have more power than the president of the United States. Now, they also, everybody recognizes that people get kicked off of Twitter for all sorts of things. This is before Twitter was taken over by Elon Musk. But it was really their concern, right? That this is a social media platform that is used often for dissidents. And this just shows that, in fact, the most powerful people can be taken off of this. I really strongly believe that broad freedom of expression protections protect the people who have the least voice in any given society. Because when people start imposing laws against speech, so I was just reading in something about how you can't show, I think it's, you can't talk against the war in Russia, right? So what people have started doing is placing flowers at the grave of a Ukrainian poet. So it's kind of a silent protest. Yet still what Putin is doing is saying, well, you can't do that either, right? You can't place flowers at someone's grave, because it's a never-ending road to make sure that people don't speak, which is why you never really want to get in this idea of, we are going to say what is good speech and what is bad speech. Because you just have people playing this reactionary game to make sure that the speech that they don't want to hear, and it's always the people in power, will not be heard. And that is really what I've learned a lot working with IFLA. So we rarely talk about censorship, we talk about restriction. We talk about things like lack of access. So this goes to the language games that you play, right? Because when you're talking about people who live in, say, Iran or Turkey, they can't use the word censor if you're going to ask them about what might be happening. So you have to really be able to finesse your language to see what sort of strictures people are living under. And this is usually librarians, about what they can and can't say in these different circumstances.
Last, I can see that there are a bunch of questions, so maybe I'll hold my last thought because we have to make time for some other folks, but I really enjoy, I mean, we could keep this going for hours, Emily. I'm sure that you don't have time, but thank you so much. I mean, the time just flew by. I hope it did for you as well. Let us turn our attention to the questions, unless there's something you'd like to just say before we do that, Emily, if there's anything you felt
No,
that
I'm
rushed.
excited to see what the questions are.
Okay, let's turn things over to Ange, who I believe is going to begin to share questions with us one at a time.
Yep, so the first question, somebody asked, what do you think about book groups who focus on banned books or have a meeting expressly to read a banned book?
Oh, so that's actually one of the things that I recommend that people do at their local public institution. You can always find something that you're interested in, because all sorts of books have been banned. If you're not familiar with the list of 850 books, a challenge books list from a representative in Texas, just look up Krause list. I'm sure you will find something on there. I think banned books, especially if you're talking about why was this book banned, and I would actually encourage you to look at it over time. So you can find books from the 16th century to now. that have been banned because it really tells you about what the anxieties were in a particular society. And I think that is a good way to think about history. If we look at books over time that get banned, so one of my favorite ones is thinking about, as a religious studies major, the people who translated the Bible into English. First they were burned at the stake, and now we live in a time where people like, you must use, especially if you're on the Christian right, the King James version, right? Which, okay, but when you think about that, you can see what were the anxieties of people who were concerned about the Bible being translated into English. And then you can think about, well, what are people trying to say when they say you should only use the King James Bible? And you can just take any book from the many, many wonderful bibliographies of banned books and see what might be of interest to you.
And we'll take another question.
Yeah, okay, the next question is from Chris. And Chris says, what would you say to someone who says to you, I do not think Huckleberry Finn should be in the libraries because of the book's use of the N-word, which is harmful and promotes racism?
I would say that that's not really an understanding of Mark Twain and Huckleberry Finn, which actually I have right here on my desk. Because I'm going to be talking about sanitizing books. There is some discussion about the idea that there are books that we should remove because they harm people who are in minoritized populations. I don't know that that does anything to help people who are in minoritized populations. I strongly feel that actually it's important that these books be available so that you can see how things have changed over time, right? It can be painful to read certain ideas that people had in the past, but actually that's not even true of Mark Twain, right? I mean, that's not what the idea he was trying to get across with Huckleberry Finn in the first place. So this often goes to interpretation, and I would say that it is really not in the best interest of understanding our world to do things like say, let's remove Huck Finn because it uses the N-word.
The scrubbing and sanitizing is certainly something that's going on. Emily, if I can just squeeze in a supplement to this question before we ask Ange for the next one. What are your thoughts on, I know some libraries, or, depending on the nature of the library, whether it's academic, school, public government, whatever, and the nature of their collection and deselection criteria and so forth, selection and deselection. Some are putting in notes inside, say, for example, the jacket of the book with some kind of disclaimer or explanation about the historical context of this. How do you feel about that? Or would you say it's a case-by-case basis, of course?
I just have to say that this is completely against the Library Bill of Rights interpretation on labeling. The idea that you are giving someone an idea of how they should think about a book never really works out very well. I do teach information organization and access here at Illinois, and I often start in a less political realm and talk about romance books. When was the last time you saw someone who seemed male identified in the romance section of your local bookstore or your local library? Why? Because what labeling actually does is say that it's performative. It says that this is what this book is and does not leave room for other interpretations about what a book should be. I completely do not think that this is something that libraries should be engaging in, because who is making those decisions? You are putting so much pressure on one person or a group of people, 5 people, to say that this is what this book is and this is how you should think about it. This is also problems with trigger warnings and those sorts of things. I really strongly disagree with this particular tactic.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's an important perspective for people to hear. And I hope that another time we can assemble a panel at CFE on the ethics of knowledge organization and the relationship between cataloging, labeling, and trigger warnings, which is really interesting. But on to the next question, Ange.
Yeah, the next question is from Madison. Madison says, don't you feel that every person has the human right not to have to confront racist books when they go to their public library?
Yes, absolutely. So this goes to Brandon Nathan's 5 laws of library science, that each book has their reader and every reader has their book. So those are not the books for you, and therefore you do not need to read them. I don't read horror, for example. I do not even walk into the horror section. I do not go to horror movies. If I see a book that is not for me, I will DNF it, right? I do not have, that is really the job of the person themselves. So also, I have to say, like, the idea of removing racist books, this goes to my thing on Agatha Christie and especially genre books, Sherlock Holmes. Those books are incredibly racist. And actually, Agatha Christie is incredibly anti-Semitic. You would have to remove so many books to have a sanitized collection of any sort, right? Also, if we're thinking about the harm that comes in books, think about self-help books, right? How many books on various diets and exercise routines do we see in libraries? Should those be removed? Even though they are often the most circulating books in any given library. Where do we make these decisions? How do we decide what is harmful and what is not? I really feel strongly that each individual person has the right to decide that that book is not for them. I have picked up books and been like, this book is just not for me. It's too scary is what really usually happens. And I just put it down and I find another book. That doesn't mean that it's not for someone else. And I guess it's what I'm also fighting against is the idea that if someone reads a book and it is quote unquote racist, that they will be racist. We have no way of knowing that. I'm not sure that's actually how transmissions of text work, that people read something and they say, this is the way the world is, definitely. And I agree with this. And because I saw it in this book, it's all fine. I just don't know that that is actually how reading actually works.
Thank you. Ange, next question.
Yeah, the next question is from Robbie. Robbie says, I have the sense that censorship has perverse effects. Can you share any examples where attempts to ban a book led to much more attention to and sales of the book?
Yes. So the big one is Mouse most recently. It was banned in McMinn County. I'm actually working on an article with my advisee, Andy Zaylet, on this. Interestingly, this goes back to my work on the Christian right and evangelicalism, because they were really looking for a clean book on the Holocaust, which do exist, actually. The Boy in the Striped Pajamas is the well-known clean Holocaust book because, of course, it does not center the Jewish experience of the Holocaust. But when McMinn County banned Mouse, it was cleaned out at Amazon. You could not find it anywhere. I think libraries across the country had like 200 holds on Mouse. Also, it was a book that was banned that moved from just people who are interested in like YA type books to an entirely new community of people who really love graphic novels, often adults. And so also Art Spiegelman had run the Pulitzer for his work. So that was of an entirely different class than a lot of the other books that we see, but that is the biggest one most recently, and I highly recommend everybody read Mouse.
Thank you. And this gives me the opportunity just to layer in that what we have seen in Canada, and it would be the same in the US, is that sometimes in challenges in our libraries, it is not just a title that's challenged, but indeed a whole genre. And graphic novels would be such a genre, as well as video games. So, Ange, next question.
Yeah, the next question is from Ali. How would you respond to library professionals on the left getting together to try to get a specific book title canceled or ostracized, or claiming that it is a hateful book that does not belong in any library?
I would strongly disagree with that. I understand that there are books that can be harmful. I guess what I'm trying to get across is that yes, books can be harmful, but it's not the job of the librarian to decide that this book is harmful for everybody, it must go away. I just don't think that that is part of understanding our professional ethics related to intellectual freedom, because you are actually putting yourself in a position of power over other people to make decisions for them, to say, I know best for you, and I have decided that this book is awful, and no one should ever know this thing, and therefore it should be eradicated from the world. I just don't know that that is actually something that you could ever do, for example. And you're engaging in the same behaviors and practices that people who would say something like, this book on drag queens is the worst thing I've ever seen in my life and needs to be eradicated from the library. I'm not sure how, you can't see those as being similar practices. Now, someone would say, but I'm on the side of angels, right? I am on the side of justice. But actually, there are not necessarily shared ideas of what justice is and how we understand it. And sometimes I truly believe in order to get to a more just world, you sometimes need to have those books that argue against it, so you can see how these ideas circulate, how you can respond to them. If a book is within your collection development policy and the parameters that you have there, you should get the book. I would be very disappointed if I went to your random public library and they don't have L. Ron Hubbard's book, that book on Scientology, his main book, right? Libraries should have that book. You can get it for free, and I would like to read it and not necessarily have to go to a Scientologist place to see it. Is that book harmful? If you watch all those documentaries about Scientology, absolutely. But does that mean that you should eradicate it and not have it available for people to read who might be interested, I don't know that that's the right thing to do.
And you can have works critical of Scientology alongside in the collection. Can I just ask you on that point to speak a little bit again to representation versus balance in the discourse of library neutrality, and then we'll go on to Ange for the next question after that.
Yeah, this is actually from Jenna Friedman, who is the zine and reference librarian at Barnard College. She talks about that libraries should strive for representation and not balance. And I find that what people say is, well, if I buy this book, I have to buy this book. But that's not really what you're trying to do. You're trying to show an overview of arguments across many different spectrums, right? So, for example, if you have books about how the keto diet is super great, you should also have books about how maybe it's not super great. I know the woman who does the maintenance phase podcast has a new book coming out about anti-fatness and dieting. You should get that book. Really thinking less about like, is my collection balanced? Because also this has an idea that like there are two sides to every argument, and often that is not true. There are many sides to all different arguments. And thinking about how am I representing these arguments best for the needs of the people in my community within my collection development policies parameters is really a better way to think about your collection.
Thanks. I see we have a little over 10 minutes left. So Ange, we'll take another question or two. And I just want to make sure that we leave time for Jim to have a last word and for Emily to have a last word before we wrap up. It's been wonderful to have so many questions. Thank you to everybody that has joined us today. Really appreciate that.
Okay, so the next question, an attendee asked, a year or so ago, the publisher of the Dr. Seuss books pulled 6 of the Dr. Seuss titles from publication because they said the books had insensitive depictions of racial, ethnic, cultural, and gender differences. Shouldn't libraries have pulled the same books from their collections following the lead of the publisher?
It depends on the library, and it depends on why they were pulling it. So all libraries should have a weeding policy, and you should see if that matches your weeding policy. I do want to say that actually in the 70s, many problematic books were already purged from libraries. These Dr. Seuss books were not part of that purge. But when libraries think about deselection, you should have a policy for deselection. I would not allow a foundation or publishers to have a say over what your deselection policy is. You should have a fully vetted policy. So it's possible that in your library, it might not make sense to pull those books. It really depends on your own policies. Because there are lots of problematic books for, one of my favorite articles to get people to read is like the problems with Babar and Babar's history, and it's how it shows, basically colonialization through this elephant, right? Are you going to pull all of your Babar books? Maybe not. These are really things to think about, and you should have a policy on when you weed and deselect your materials.
And yeah, I was just in a group this week where a Tintin book was under discussion, and members of our group were in different parts of the country, and there it was voiced that it's important to have nuance about, you know, how this might be handled in a library in Quebec may be different than how this might be handled in a library in a different part of the country. I think we have time for another question or two.
Okay, the next question, an attendee asks, most demands to ban a book justify the demand in terms of the harm it does, but who in society should get to determine what constitutes harm that would warrant the removal of a book from a public library?
So I think that's overall the problem with banning books, is that people are saying, I know what the harm is, but actually it's better to think about it a little bit differently, which is that they're saying, I see that this has harm, right? That this can cause harm, and therefore I'm taking it upon myself to make sure that other people will not be harmed by this book. It's sort of this very like outward facing idea on I know best for other people. It's extremely paternalistic. Libraries should collect books that are within their collection development policy. I know I keep saying that over and over again, but that's why the policy exists. People are welcome to bring requests for consideration and say, I think that maybe this is not the best book. Or I think this book should be in a different section of the library. That is part of being a public institution, is that people are able to say those things back. And it's sometimes they might be right. Sometimes something might be out of scope, or it might be cataloged and shelved in the wrong place. That's absolutely possible. The point is that you go through the process of discussing it. And it's not just one person's decision, and it's not just a minority veto. That is really the main issue, is that you have people who are very loud, who say things, and the people who may be most interested in these books or maybe helped by these books are not necessarily the people that you are hearing from, maybe because they're afraid to speak or whatever. But it's important that the idea of moving a book be discussed in the community, following the policy and procedures that have been laid out beforehand.
And I really like that you brought out the weeding. You know, when does the challenge emanate from, you know, weeding, and vice versa. And it is every ounce of intellectual and professional energy that goes into selection must equally so go into deselection. And that's so important to discuss with our boards and our staff. And you know, there's always the threat of deprofessionalization. And if we don't set out our criteria, somebody else is going to do it for us, as we're seeing in the media every day now. Do we have time for another question, Ange?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. The next question, Pat is from Pat. There's an evangelical ex-celebrity making the rounds of public libraries in the US now, where he offers to read his book to kids. If libraries aren't interested, he cries censorship. Any tips for hearing such people out and politely sending them on their way without feeling we have to oblige them?
I actually would not recommend doing that. You should also have a meeting policy, a meeting room policy, and I think that's Kirk Cameron, if his talk meets your meeting room policy, let him talk. Because what happens when you get into saying this person is worth hearing, this person is not worth hearing, is that is where you get into not hearing voices from people who are not heard very much. Because someone will say, you know, I don't want to hear from these people who represent Black Lives Matter, because that is a racist organization, and your meeting room policy says that racists can't meet in your room, right? You have to come through with all these ideas of how to not have people speak. So have a good meeting room policy. If Kirk Cameron meets that reading room policy, let him talk. I think the effort to deplatform people is often very ineffective, and also is something that can be turned against people who do not have as much power in our society. I am always nervous when people say, I don't want this person to speak because X, Y, and Z, because you'll just have people in power say, well, you know, that person is talking about injustice. And this is something that Moms for Liberty talks about. Injustice, and injustice is just another way of saying how white people are bad, and therefore I don't want them to speak at our public library. Getting into those sorts of arguments is not really what you want to do if you are working towards a more just society. You know, so like, let Kirk Cameron speak. I mean, I don't know what you get from not letting him speak. You know, I don't know what's accomplished by that. Because there are people there who are just like, oh, I'm just interested to hear what this person has to say. I wonder know what these arguments are on the other side, on his side, because obviously there are people who agree with him. I just worry about getting into those sorts of ideas about who should we not have based on criteria that can be turned against your actual the actual outcome that you want. Because Kirk Cameron thinks that he is being righteous and just. That is key to understanding this entire argument, is that it's not that people think that they are doing harm by making these arguments. They actually think that they have the better moral argument.
And on the flip side, sorry, Emily, on the flip side, a censor is usually operating from a position in their mind and way of thinking of good intention to protect somebody, often children. So on both sides, often there is the idea of good intention, but not that other people would necessarily agree with. I think we can squeeze in one more question. I'm sorry if I cut you off there, Emily. Did you want to say anything else before?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
One more.
Okay. Yeah. And the next question from Ali. If you don't think that we should ban books that use racist language to fight racism, what should we do?
So this is really about theory of change. The way that you fight racism is by helping people understand the world in which we live, which is rife with white supremacy, where people are benefiting from genocide and slavery, the idea that people live in worlds of privilege, by educating the next generation on how to live in a more just society, by thinking more collectively about what do we owe other people. That is how you fight racism. It is much harder and takes much more effort than getting rid of a book. Getting rid of a book is very superficial. If you have a racist people in your family, do you confront them on their racism? Do you not confront them? Are you thinking about your own privileges? I'm a Black woman, but I have privileges of education and class. How am I using those privileges to make the world a better place? Am I calling in people who are engaging in lazy stereotypes about others? Do I really think about people in terms of, well, something that happens here in the United States, we use the word urban to really mean Black people, and then we talk about Chicago. Am I working, for example, to make sure that people can vote? We've had a decimation of our voting rights amendment here. What am I doing to make a difference there? Am I talking about systemic issues within my society? Am I talking clearly about the history of our land and how it was forcibly taken from people, even if that implicates me and the privileges and benefits that I have from that? Removing a book is very easy. The actual work is very hard. And I think that we're often looking for easier answers, because sometimes it means that we have to look at ourselves, we have to look at the people we love, and really try to engage with them, when they say things about, I don't know, sometimes just like the lazy person that was helping them at McDonald's, and how all those people are, right? That is the sort of thing, and you say, what do you mean by that? Who are those people? And you have to put yourself out there. Removing the book will not remove racist language or racism or white supremacy or misogyny, homophobia, transphobia from the world.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you to all that had questions that we had time to share, and thanks to those that had questions we didn't have time to share. And I'd like to give Ange and Jim an opportunity to round us off here. And Emily, I'll just say thank you, because you really did give life to the theme of our conversation on censorship is no friend of social justice.
Well, Toni, I want to join you in thanking Emily, and I want to thank you as well. This was a really engaging conversation you had and very informative. And I think some measure of that was shown by the number of questions we had. Well, we got to a lot of questions. There are a lot of questions we didn't even get to. So I want to thank the audience as well for being with us today and for considering these matters. A video of today's conversation will be posted on the Center for Free Expression website tomorrow. That website is cfe.torontomu.ca. And we also will be posting a list of resources for those of you who are interested in this issue and want to read more about it or see videos about it. So there'll be tomorrow, if you enjoyed this and you want to recommend it to your friends or colleagues, please tell them about the video being there, and as well about the additional resources that you might find useful. So it's cfe.torontomu.ca. Thank you all very much for attending today, and I hope you'll come back to our events in future. You can see them listed on our website. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.